Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about modafinil and whether we should be using more of it. So this time I actually do have a disclaimer in addition to being the author of Recognizing Adult ADHD. That's my book. My other disclaimer is 21 years ago I did go to a conference, two-day conference by Cephalon, which is then the manufacturer of modafinil, so some of what I say today may be biased by what I heard 21 years ago. I hope I have formed my own independent opinions, and you'll note during the speech that everything I say is not going to be positive about Cephalon. So if you have questions while I'm talking, you can certainly type them in. This will be posted on YouTube and Facebook. The takeaway message is that modafinil works distinctly differently than traditional stimulants. It does help, clearly, some people with ADHD. It may help with a broader range of alertness, intelligence, action, so it's used widely off-label now and off prescription. So again, those are not FDA-approved uses, which are very narrow. So in more detail, it's a work day. Your alarm clock goes off, you wake up. The alarm clock is tapping into one of our ways of waking up, and that's the startle system, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So when you hear a loud noise, when you hear a loud sound, when someone shoves you, when your anxiety wakes you up, those are all the startle system, probably strongly dependent on norepinephrine, to arouse you, to startle you, to shake you alert and awake. In contrast, let's pretend it's a weekend day and you have time to turn off the alarm. Nobody's snoring near you. There aren't people playing in the next room. And you just wake up naturally. You're alert, but you're not overstimulated. You're not overactivated. That is a separate wake-up system. Your brain, again, has two very different wake-up systems. The stimulants tap into that first sympathetic drive arousal system. The modafinil, its generic name is modafinil, brand name is Provigil, and a very similar related drug is armodafinil, which is Nuvigil. These drugs are called eugeroics, so not stimulants, they are eugeroics, which means sort of true wakefulness. It's a made-up word. As all our words are made-up words. There is not consensus yet among neuroscientists about how this is working, how modafinil is working. We do know a fair amount. It's not a complete black box. So modafinil has fairly weak effects on dopamine system, boosting dopamine. It's a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So they're very weak, but very selective. So rather than causing dopamine release, activation all over the brain, it's very specifically in regions of the hypothalamus and a little bit in the amygdala and a few other areas. But if you look at what areas of the brain are activated by Ritalin or activated by Adderall, dopamine and norepinephrine systems across the brain light up. This is, again, a very selective, more specific system, and the fairly immediate effect of boosting dopamine in the hypothalamic regions here is that there's an increase or release of orexin. And orexin is a protein that signals normal, happy arousal, wakefulness. Sorry, happy arousal, not startle arousal. I'll try to avoid using arousal in that sense. So normal awakefulness, normal alertness. So the good things about this is it means modafinil has a very different side effect profile. It has a very different set of risks and benefits than the traditional stimulants. So side effects tend to be pretty infrequent with modafinil. Headache happens in about 5 to 10% of people in studies. Things like nausea, decreased appetite, drier mouth, runny nose happen in the 5 to 10% of people range. Clinically, the only side effects I've seen Our headache, probably a little more than 10%, but less than a quarter of people. Headaches tend to be mild, tend to go away within a few days. And I've had a few people with dry mouth. I've never seen significant GI effects. I've never seen significant appetite effects. And again, both of those are common. More importantly, one of the big potential problems for some people with the stimulants is that there is a risk with any of them and with most of our non-stimulants, including Strattera, atomoxetine, or Wellbutrin, or Cymbalta. All of those have some risk for increasing blood pressure, increasing heart rate. Again, this is not tapping into the sympathetic nervous system, so modafinil, study after study, no impact on blood pressure or heart rate, because it's considered to be allied to or connected to the stimulants. There are still some warnings and some that say people with certain arrhythmias should avoid it, or other cardiac conditions. As far as I can tell, that is completely put in by association, and I've not found any evidence of heart risk damage from modafinil. There's one rare side effect, and there's a fair amount of debate how rare it is. So whether possible of very serious skin rashes or conditions, I will get back to that later. It's absolutely clear that if it is really linked to modafinil, it's very uncommon. And one other prominent advantage over the stimulants is they're in almost all laboratory tests, even though this does tap into the dopamine system weakly, the potential for it being an addictive substance is not supported by the laboratory science, and at a clinical level, this does not seem to be a particularly addictive substance. That risk just doesn't seem to be there, again, where it's there with the stimulant medications. So this modafinil was developed in France initially to treat narcolepsy and approved about 86 for that purpose. And then within a few years, the French military got highly involved in this. And why would the military care about a narcolepsy medication? It's not that soldiers are dropping off its sleep in the middle of the day, unless they're tremendously sleep deprived, which militaries like having soldiers who are, you can count on at least 24/7 around the clock to be shooting at killing the enemy. And it was found in studies first by the French military and then much more substantially funded in the 90s by the US military, that modafinil is really good at keeping people awake and alert. And unlike the stimulants, which can make people aggressive, aggravated, trigger happy, and there were several friendly fire incidents where we dropped bombs on Canadian troops very early in the Afghan war, and a variety of other bad incidents which were blamed, whether rightly or wrongly, on US troops using Ritalin or Adderall-like products, traditional stimulants. So again, the US military had a huge incentive to find something that helps you be alert, awake, and not trigger happy and particularly aggressive. So US approval for modafinil, again under the name Provigil, was approved in '98, and it was approved for 3 very narrowly defined uses. So it was approved for narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is quite rare condition where people are falling asleep spontaneously or sometimes with emotional triggers. There's other symptoms connected with it, but this helped quite well with helping people stay awake and not have episodes of abruptly falling asleep. It was also approved for shift work sleep disorder, where people, such as nurses who are on a rotating schedule of being awake in the day shift, night shift, evening shift, rotating it, and we know that that's horrible for your circadian rhythms. We know that the likelihood of accidents, problems, lower performance is great when you are working at a time your circadian clock tells you to be sleeping, and there do seem to be profound long-term health problems connected with shift work. But modafinil was effective at keeping people awake during their new shift, which until, again, clocks could adjust to it. And the third indication was for the use in sleep apnea, so daytime sleepiness connected with sleep apnea, but only after someone had tried CPAP and that was either not fully effective or not effective at all. So if CPAP wasn't good enough to alleviate your daytime sleepiness, then you could use modafinil. So part of what was curious is that Cephalon faced a sort of a decision point. Already in the 90s, they had extensive data that modafinil worked for a huge variety of daytime sleepiness conditions. It was helpful for multiple sclerosis. It was helpful for daytime fatigue associated with Parkinson's disease. It was helped with daytime fatigue associated with a whole host of different classes of sedating medications. It was helpful even with surgical anesthesia. People woke up more quickly and alertly if you gave them modafinil. So they had a potential for pursuing, do we go for a huge number of indications, because daytime sleepiness, particularly number one cause is sleep deprivation. This works for daytime sleepiness caused by sleep deprivation, which in the American public, almost a third of adults are self-subjecting themselves to sleep deprivation. Modafinil clearly works in all these conditions, so they faced sort of a business decision. Do we market this? Do we get approval for a broader range of conditions, try to sell a huge amount of it, or do we go for a very select, specific, narrow market and just charge a hell of a lot and make our money that way? They went for the charge a hell of a lot and make their money that way. And this is partly related to how widespread or wide used it is. So for years, those three, narcolepsy, shift work sleep disorder, and sleep apnea if CPAP fails were the only U.S. indications. And the drug was priced at more than $10, $12 a day for years. Then in 2007, I think it is, the patent was close to expiring, and they developed Provigil, and I'll get into in a minute what Provigil is. They jacked up the price of, So Provigil, modafinil, was going off patent. They jacked up the price from $12 to $25 a pill. They then released Nuvigil, which is our modafinil, and priced that around $12 so that hopefully people would all migrate from one to the newer drug, which again had a new patent life on it. And this is actually the first and only time in my almost 30 years in the psychiatric field where drug reps were actually embarrassed by their company's financial actions in terms of pricing. So again, the pricing kept it extremely narrow audience. It also meant that invariably insurers, even though again there were documented studies looking at this for a whole host of sedating circumstances, insurers only allowed it to be used in most cases for these very narrowly marketed FDA-approved uses. So the Cephalon's behavior gets even worse, so that once the generic version of Provigil was approved in 2007, I may have the year off 1 or 2 years, Cephalon actually cut a deal, paid off several of the big generic drug makers, so that Cephalon was the only generic maker of their own brand name product until 2012 before it entered onto the market. And for years after 2012, I don't know if it's collusion, I don't know if it's just happy coincidence, you call it what you want, but the price for even the generic stayed as expensive as the brand name till about 3 years ago, and then, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, Costco started selling Provigil or Nuvigil for about $2 a pill rather than about $12 a pill. I've recently checked with GoodRx, and this is the drug where I think it shows more revealingly than almost any other medication. Some of the corruption, some of the ridiculousness with letting the, quote, free market, capitalism, determine drug prices in our country. So a month's worth of Provigil, generic modafinil, is about $30 at Costco. If you go to Safeway, and if you have a coupon, and this is data from GoodRx, but it's supported by a myriad of patient reports back to me, if you go to Safeway and you don't have a coupon from GoodRx, they charge more than $1,000 for a month's worth of modafinil. If you have the GoodRx coupon, they're about $40. But even if you have that coupon and you go to Walgreens in the San Francisco area is charging about $385 for a month's worth of Provigil, and Target's charging about $360. All the exact same substance. This is how ridiculous our marketplace is. And again, it's relevant because the high price has kept many people from using it, discouraged off-label prescribing by many by doctors, and particularly if it's forcing people to more dangerous alternatives, it's not a good option or not a reasonable policy. So the numbers, when I looked up 2019 numbers, were less than 1 million prescriptions a year, somewhere high 900,000s were being Provigil, Nuvigil, Modafinil, Armodafinil, less than 1 million prescriptions. For Ritalin products in the U.S., methylphenidate, the numbers I think were about 14 million prescriptions. For Adderall, amphetamine, Vyvanse, dextroamphetamine, lysine linked. Collectively, amphetamine-based products were more than 38 million prescriptions. So the prescription stimulant market is more than, or about 50 times as big as the modafinil market in the U.S. And clearly much less risk of addiction, if any, much less risk of psychotic reactions, much less risk of heart-related issues. So specifically looking at ADHD, does it work as well? Well, studies are smaller in number. This has not been approved for FDA, but several years ago, Cephalon went through the studies, did the research to get this approved for ADD in kids. And in terms of robustness of response, again, not quite as robust as systemic summer meta-analyses of Adderall-based products, but comparable to Ritalin effects. Again, not everyone was helped, but many kids were helped substantially. So the efficacy was clearly there. Why it wasn't approved was a single kid in the trials for getting it approved for ADHD developed a dangerous rash. And we may sort of laugh, how can a rash be dangerous? There's a rash called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which essentially creates third-degree blisters, burns over your whole body, and it can actually be fatal. If you get such a rash, stop the drug immediately. That seems to be triggering it, and there are approaches to hopefully prevent a horrific outcome. So again, one kid in the study developed this. Of the doctors on the FDA approval panel, the one dermatologist on this panel said, Stevens-Johnson syndromes happen with almost every drug out there. From our previous data, we do not see a strong association between modafinil and Stevens-Johnson. This should be approved. The psychiatrist on the panel said, oh my God, a serious medical condition. We don't usually have to deal with those in psychiatry. We don't feel comfortable. Or maybe more politely, they felt that the risks outweighed the benefits for it. That's a judgment call, and I'm not sure how accurate or how that judgment was, but that's, so again, there are studies. There's always would be wonderful to have more of modafinil's benefits for ADHD, but it has not been approved for such. Furthermore, and this is maybe right now a fringe view, I think it will grow in acceptance and pervasiveness throughout the ADD field, and particularly Brown University researchers have focused a lot on their studies indicate that the stimulants actually are primarily helpful with motivation, getting you to do a task, rather than helping you be more focused or attentive necessarily during a task. And some of their evidence also suggests that modafinil, in contrast, isn't particularly working on motivation, but maybe more truly or validly be a precise ADHD drug in terms of helping with focus, sustained concentration, or alertness. So I alluded to earlier, the numbers I mentioned earlier are sort of the legitimate, well, not all legitimate because some are written for off-label uses, but modafinil is one of the drugs that's being widely used for brain hacking for Silicon Valley and other young professionals who want to be more alert, more awake. There's very weak evidence that it may help with a broader range of being intelligent, cognitively aware, on track, performing well. And it is, again, being used widely in that realm. My argument would be, again, that it objectively is clearly, even if Stevens-Johnson syndrome is associated with it, that's still a lower risk, even in the worst crunching of the data so far, than the risk of amphetamine-induced psychosis, the risk of addiction, the risk of problems that are uncommon but are clearly associated with the stimulants. And clinically, my results are sort of similar to what is out there. I'd say I have a handful of people who substantially preferred modafinil to the stimulants. I have many more others who felt that its effects were not as clear-cut or not as robust. And some of that may be, again, purely ADD benefits, but the thing we have to remember is that stimulants also increase energy as well as alertness and also increase mood. Modafinil, even though it does seem to have, and again, this evidence is preliminary, some antidepressant properties, it is not in general a mood elevator at standard dosage range. So I'm not seeing any questions, but so I will be logging off momentarily. Next week's topic is ADHD and social anxiety. Have a safe and sane week. That's all.